She was a recovering addict who finally turned her life around.
She'd become really positive in her life and she wanted to do something for the future.
She was caring, loving. She did anything she could to help anybody.
Until she decided to stand up to the neighborhood bully.
This had been an ongoing feud that had lasted for over 6 months.
She saw herself as the queen of Beverly Road.
This had all got way out of hand and neither of them were going to back down.
But when their feud ends in bloodshed, will investigators catch the right killer?
It looked like it would be quite a straightforward investigation, but that certainly wasn't the case.
June 29th, 2017. Around 7:15 p.m., police in Humberside, England, receive calls about a fight that has broken out on Beverly Road in the town of Hull.
Hull's a very working class city. It's got a population of around 260,000.
Officers arrive to find several people gathered outside a row of apartments.
Onlookers pointed them towards the apartment where the fight occurred. And inside, there's a woman on the floor covered in blood.
She sustained a single stab wound to her chest. And aside from that single stab wound, there were no other visible injuries that could be seen at the time. So officers provided immediate medical attention to her, CPR, to try and get her back round.
As paramedics rush the woman to the hospital, Detective Alan Curtis begins an investigation.
I was the on-call senior investigating officer for the area. So I set some fast-track actions in terms of what I wanted for the scenes to be secured, evidence to be preserved, etc. They don't know whether it's going to be fatal or not.
The first thing he learns is the identity of the victim, 39-year-old Joanne Hemingway.
Joanne was born in 1978 in the town of Hull. She was a middle child with a younger brother and an older sister. Her mother was a nurse. Her father was a truck driver, or a lorry driver, as they say in the UK. And that upbringing gave her a no-nonsense kind of personality.
She was straight to the point. People say, like, you just know where you stood with her.
But Joanne's childhood didn't last very long.
Joanne got pregnant when she was about 15 or 16 years old and had her only daughter, Roxanne.
Joanne loved her daughter, but she had many challenges and struggles in her life, mainly revolving around drug and alcohol addiction.
She did go down that road for a short period of her life. Obviously it was hard. And I was a child. People, like in my family and my mum as well, protected me from it.
In her early 20s, Joanne found herself living on the streets, forcing her to give up custody of her daughter.
Because of the lifestyle that Joanne had at the time, Roxanne went to live with maternal grandparents.
I was there a lot, so it wasn't really a massive change for me. And I still did see my mum. She did make mistakes like everybody does. And she was regretful of a lot of things as well.
But in 2009, after years of struggling with addiction, Joanne finally found a light at the end of the tunnel.
She was helped by a service called the Lighthouse Project, which really supported my mum, like, through all the bad times.
The Lighthouse Project was a faith-led organisation that helps people turn their lives around.
That's when Joanne decided to change. She'd become really positive in her life and she wanted to do something for the future, for her own and for her family's sake.
Even after she started getting back on her feet, she stayed active in the program. She wanted to give back by helping others like herself.
My mum would attend like every Thursday, I think it was, in the afternoon. My mum said that they were in the same book but they're just on different pages, which was quite nice because that's like quite inspirational thing for my mum to say.
By 2016, Joanne had finally gotten off the streets and moved into an apartment on Beverly Road.
Beverly Road traditionally was a very affluent area of Hull. There's lots of old buildings, but it's not as vibrant and a rich urban population as it was before. It is in need of some reinvestment.
She was in her mid-30s by that point, and even though it might not have been the safest of neighborhoods, it was a step up from what she was used to, and it must have been nice to finally have a place for herself.
Joanne's nurturing attitude also earned her plenty of new friends.
She was caring, loving. She did anything she could possible to help anybody, really.
Because these areas can be quite difficult and dangerous and challenging. She was very protective of the other people that lived in the flats, so they could always rely on Joanne.
Being on the road to recovery also had a positive effect on her relationships with family members.
I would spend lots of time with her. We'd go out for tea. She'd meet me on my dinner from work and we'd go to my nana's house. We were really close.
In fact, things were going so well for Joanne, she was even planning a family vacation.
She'd saved money for a passport and she wanted to go on holiday with me. We was going to go in the summer later on. She was just looking forward to the future. It was bright for her.
But those plans had ended in a violent attack. Now Joanne is in critical condition, and police are working to find out what happened.
What we wanted to do initially was to determine, did we have any witnesses in the area that had actually seen the stabbing?
Coming up, investigators uncover the first piece of the puzzle.
When she was stabbed, the knife had broken in two.
This was obviously fueled by a lot of rage.
"39-year-old Joanne Hemingway has been rushed to the hospital after she was found stabbed inside her Humberside apartment."
Joanne Hemingway had been stabbed and she'd been assaulted in quite a violent attack.
Joanne had suffered a single stab wound to the chest. Obviously, she suffered massive internal bleeding.
The next of kin were immediately notified, and up until that point they had no idea what had gone on. When they got that phone call, it was the first time that they'd heard that she'd been involved in this assault.
We was put into a room and we was just told to wait. The nurses and the doctor came through and said that my mum had lost consciousness for a couple of minutes, but they'd got her heart working again and they was going to operate on her.
Meanwhile, detectives are trying to identify her assailants.
I got the initial call, so I then followed that up immediately with a scene visit to support the officers that were down there and give them clear direction. It was difficult to determine a motive or even identify the offenders initially, so I was very much open-minded because it could have been one of many different hypotheses. It could have been a complete random attack, of maybe a robbery that had gone wrong. It might have been domestic related with maybe a partner. I didn't really know at the time.
Crime in Beverley Road these days is quite high. There have been a number of murders in the Beverley Road area in the past couple of years.
So there was a big outcry, there was a lot of anger, and at that time not a lot of information was being released. All we knew was that something quite severe had taken place.
So the first thing police do is canvass the area, looking for anyone who might have seen what happened.
This was an incident that had occurred at 7 o'clock on a main thoroughfare through Hull, sort of rush hour traffic, lots of traffic passing by in the middle of the street. It's not something you would expect in Hull or anywhere else in the country really to happen.
Several bystanders claim to have seen the fight, but none of their accounts are the same.
Sometime between 6:30 and 6:50, an altercation had taken place in the street. This seemed to be a verbal altercation between a number of individuals, and that argument had escalated.
They each saw something different. Some said there were 3 people, some said there were 5 people fighting.
The only thing witnesses agree on is that after Joanne was stabbed, her attackers had run into a nearby apartment.
We'd had secured 3 separate scenes. There was a scene where the stabbing had actually occurred, which was on the main thoroughfare and street on Beverley Road. There was the scene which was the flat where Joanne had gone into at the point of her collapse. And there was a third scene, because initial information at the time was that the offenders that had committed the offence had gone into a nearby flat.
Police quickly obtained access to that apartment. They were hoping they still might be able to catch whoever did this, but no such luck.
There was no one in the flat where we believed the offenders had gone to, and we couldn't fast time process the CCTV, so we were unsure of a direction of travel that the offenders might have gone in.
At the scene, detectives do find an important piece of evidence.
They found the broken handle of a kitchen knife, but just the handle. The blade was missing. So then they went to try to look for it.
It was found subsequently during a search and pointed out by one of the significant witnesses has been found on the road at the scene.
It had a serrated blade like a kitchen knife, so naturally, police believe this is the other half of the handle they found in the apartment, and it was most likely the weapon used to stab Joanne.
We understand from evidence that was found at the scene that when she was stabbed, the knife had broken in two, and the blade of the knife had subsequently fallen out of her chest on the road.
They also know it's not easy to break a knife in two. So this was obviously fueled by a lot of rage. Someone really hated Joanne and wanted her dead.
But who could have hated a woman like Joanne Hemingway that much?
She lived at Beverly Road and she'd been there a year. She'd made lots of friends and she was seen as a popular member of that block of flats. Very supportive of the other individuals in there, and she had some really good friends living in the flats there or thereabouts around where she was. You would imagine there might be some fingerprints or contact DNA that would be contained on the knife. So the knife handle was recovered, the knife blade was recovered. We also recovered some clothing from the flat where Joanne had been worked on that had been discarded.
Police also began collecting CCTV footage from the surrounding buildings, hoping one of them recorded the fight. In the meantime, investigators speak further with two of their witnesses.
We actually had two significant witnesses that were identified, and they were friends of Joanne who were with her before, at the point of, and also after the incident.
So these friends are able to give police the names of 3 individuals they claim were the ones who were fighting with Joanne.
The suspects turn out to be Joanne's nearby neighbors, Angela Burkett, Glenn Foster, and Gemma Joyce.
That was further corroborated by some of the checks on the housing that we completed. The flat the offenders had gone into, that was actually Angela Burkett's flat. We were unsure who they were at first, but we'd also cordoned off and secured that particular flat itself on the road.
Joanne's friends also claim they know which one of them stabbed her.
During the course of our investigation, with the time that we had in custody, we took significant witness accounts from 2 individuals. Both those people had said that it was actually Glenn Ronnie Foster who had stabbed Joanne Hemingway, and he was the one that was carrying a knife.
The evidence is piling up pretty quickly against them for attempted murder. What no one understands yet is why.
Coming up, a citywide manhunt begins.
We had the resources mobilized from the whole division within Humberside Police.
Hours after Joanne Hemingway was found bleeding to death in an apartment, detectives have the names of 3 suspects.
From the initial information that I had, we gathered at the scene, from the witness testimonies, and from the fast time immediate local inquiries, there were no other suspects that had been identified at that time other than the 3 people seen to have an altercation, who we believe to be Angela Burkett, Glenn Ronnie Foster, and Gemma Joyce.
So there are no signs of them at their apartment, but it hadn't been very long since the stabbing, so police knew they couldn't have gotten very far.
Our main focus in those initial stages was actually the manhunt inquiries. A lot of our resources were dedicated to try and find these offenders.
While the manhunt gets underway, officers take statements from 2 of Joanne's friends who were with her during the assault.
Significant witness evidence that they provided was that Glenn Ronnie Foster plunged this knife into her chest.
They couldn't say for sure what caused him to attack Joanne, but he and the 2 other women had shown up at her apartment a little before 7 p.m. looking for a fight.
Angela and Glenn was all shouting up to my mum, like sort of goading her to come out.
They could be seen shouting up towards the flat where we believed Joanne was at the time. Joanne can then be seen coming out of the flat with something in her hand, which we subsequently discovered to be some kind of metal pole. She'd walked over to where these people were, and then there was a fight between some of the individuals involved.
They said it was chaotic, but the two witnesses at the scene, Joanne's friends, swore it was Glenn that had stabbed Joanne in the chest during the fight. They were able to get Joanne back into the apartment, and that's when she suddenly collapsed.
Her adrenaline was going so much, I don't even think she had realised that she had been stabbed, because only when she gets back to the address that she then collapses.
Back at the station, some of the officers are familiar with two of Joanne's attackers and their criminal records. 42-year-old Glenn Ronnie Foster was born and raised in Hull, and he has a long history of run-ins with the law.
Foster is incredibly well known in the Hull area. He's got a reputation as being a career criminal. It's mainly dishonesty offences, and he's been a long-term drug abuser as well.
Glenn Foster is a very skinny man. To look at him, you wouldn't think he could harm a fly, but in reality, I think that's probably a bit different.
He and Burkett had been a couple for several years, and they lived together in her apartment.
52-year-old Angela Burkett was known to authorities as well.
Angela Burkett's reputation precedes her, and actually in some ways I think she was incredibly proud about that reputation. She's got loads of previous convictions, long-term drug abuse, career criminal, horrible with the officers. She was a challenging individual. She was aggressive and always spoke her mind, and she was not a shrinking violet in any way, shape or form.
Angela Burkett was known for stirring up trouble, and she was very threatening to people if she didn't get her own way. People were actually scared of her. They didn't want to meet her in the hallway. She was just a very unpleasant person.
A lot of people knew who Angela was and did say that she was a bully. She would also beg outside of shops and then become aggressive when people would refuse to give her money.
Because of her drug addiction and all of her lifestyle and circumstances around her was very much a day-to-day existence. It was stealing to pay for a drug habit by whatever means necessary.
Like Joanne, she'd been living on the street until she was placed in public housing on Beverly Road.
The third name given to police, Gemma Joyce, turns out to be Angela's 34-year-old daughter.
She had lived with them on and off. It was a similar situation to Joanne and her daughter, actually, except Burkett had never gotten clean.
It was at this point that I made a policy decision to nominate them as suspects for what was at the time an attempted murder, because it was still a stabbing at this time.
None of their past arrests were for violent crimes, however. So what could have caused Glenn Foster to stab Joanne? Investigators would soon get an opportunity to ask him, because only 2 hours into the manhunt, all three suspects are found.
We had the resources mobilised from the whole division within Humberside Police, and we had a series of community officers, response officers, plainclothes officers out trying to look for Glenn Ronnie Foster, for Angela Burkett and also Gemma Joyce. They had been seen on an area further down on Beverly Road by plainclothes officers. All three were detained and arrested for the attempted murder of Joanne Hemingway.
Police immediately collect their clothing and send it to the lab for blood and DNA analysis.
But before detectives can interrogate their suspects, they receive some unfortunate news.
Whilst they were being searched and taken to the police station, I got a call through at 9:06 to say that Joanne had passed away. The information passed to me from the hospital was that Joanne had succumbed to her injuries, namely the single stab wound to her chest.
She suffered a massive cardiac arrest from the internal bleeding, and despite hospital's best efforts, there was nothing they could do to save her.
I just sort of crumbled into the wall. It's just unbelievable. It was just all happened so quickly. There was a lot going through my mind. Like somebody was responsible for my mum dying. We just didn't know why.
The case has officially become a homicide investigation. Hoping for a quick confession, detectives confront the trio with the eyewitness testimony.
Glenn Ronnie Foster completely flatly denied being involved in the offence, admitted he was there, but when asked about who had actually stabbed Joanna Hemingway, didn't give any account.
So when Foster wouldn't talk, they tried Burkett and her daughter, but they weren't any easier to crack.
Angela Burkett never actually made any comment during those initial interviews whatsoever. Gemma Joyce gave an account of being there and obviously named the other people that were there, but said that she hadn't actually seen anything. So evidently, that didn't take us any further forward.
Coming up, police finally get the break they've been looking for. But it's not what they expected.
She told various people that she would regret what she had done that day.
There was about to be a real twist in the case.
Detectives in the town of Hull are questioning 42-year-old Glenn Foster, his girlfriend, 52-year-old Angela Burkett, and her daughter, 34-year-old Gemma Joyce, in the murder of Joanne Hemingway.
Police had two witnesses, friends of Joanne, that were there, and they said that Glenn was the one who stabbed Joanne in the chest.
Joanne was well known, and actually so were the individuals that were arrested on suspicion of her murder. So I think the community was in shock.
So far, the suspects aren't talking, but investigators are about to get some answers from a different source.
Fortunately for the investigation team, there was CCTV footage of the incident itself. It was from a Civic camera pointing down the road towards the incident. It was at some distance, but fortunately the camera was pointing in the right direction. It picked up the incident itself, it picked up what happened before and also the aftermath.
The video confirms that 3 people were involved in the attack, but unfortunately, police can't verify their identities.
The quality of that footage was so grainy that it was very hard to see actually who was who.
What it did show was that 4 people stood on Beverley Road at around, the point of the scene where we believe the attack took place. And a figure can be seen walking out of one of the flats on Beverley Road. We've subsequently identified that person as Joanne Hemingway, closely followed by 2 individuals who were friends of hers who were in a flat at the time. Joanne walks over to where these 3 people are on Beverley Road, and there's an altercation that takes place.
When homicide police looked at the CCTV footage, they couldn't really tell who these individuals were. The faces were unrecognisable because of the pixelation, so they couldn't clearly say who had inflicted the fatal blow that killed Joanne Hemingway.
In addition to the CCTV footage, police also found dash cam recordings from several vehicles that were in the area that night, but they didn't give a clear picture either.
That evidence was used to corroborate some of our witness testimony to identify the people that were actually involved, but it didn't cover the point at which we believe Joanne had been stabbed. Nothing did.
However, when the footage is enhanced, police get a clearer picture of what happened.
The officers did some really good work around that, so you can pick up people going in and out of the address, and we think we can see sort of a shine off a knife that comes out. And the enhancement was good. There was definitely a fight.
Joanne can then be seen coming out of her apartment with some kind of metal pole, closely followed by her 2 friends, just like they said.
Still hard to say exactly when Joanne was stabbed during the fight, since she doesn't fall to the ground or anything, but it does seem to indicate who stabbed her.
The dashcam footage that we'd obtained whilst they were in custody clearly identified Glenn Ronnie Foster as having a large knife in his right hand and a baseball bat in his left hand.
Detectives hope forensic tests on the blade found at the scene will prove Foster is their killer. In the meantime, they decide to move forward with the evidence they have.
Police can actually only hold subjects for a certain amount of hours without bringing charges. They get an extension, but they're running out of time, and none of them were talking.
Just before the custody time had expired, we went for a charging decision to the Crown Prosecution Service. Glenn Ronnie Foster was charged and he was remanded in custody. Gemma Joyce and Angela Burkett were released under investigation at the time.
He was the one that had gone there armed with a baseball bat and a knife, so it was clear that he had premeditated this incident.
But investigators still don't have a motive.
They had this evidence against Glenn, but they had no idea why Glenn would stab Joanne. They didn't know what the fight was all about.
Looking for answers, police decide to reach out to the public.
sometimes, people are reluctant to come forward and give us evidential accounts. Unless things are recorded evidentially, then, we're never going to get people to court.
Humberside police ran a series of appeals, and it was from off the back of these appeals that several fresh eyewitnesses came forward that had not only seen the altercation, some of them had seen the lead up to it.
Additional witnesses gave police some very interesting information.
One of Joanne's neighbors says everyone in the area knows who hated Joanne enough to kill her, but it wasn't Glenn Foster.
It soon became apparent that Joanne had had some previous altercations with Angela Burkett.
Apparently, there'd been a feud going on between these two women for quite a while. Angela was extremely belligerent towards the other people, and Joanne tried to help them. So it seemed inevitable that these two would butt heads.
Basically, Joanne had been bullied by Angela Burkett for 6 months prior to the fatal attack.
According to the neighbor, 4 days before the murder, those arguments began to escalate.
Joanne Hemingway had been cycling past Angela Burkett further up Beverly Road, at which point Angela Burkett had made a derogatory comment to her.
Angela had called my mum a fat cow, I think, which my mum wasn't happy about, and I think more so because she was trying hard at the gym. So it did really upset my mum.
Later that afternoon, Joanne decided to confront Angela.
The two of them argued, and then it turned physical, and Joanne shoved Angela to the ground.
Angela Burkett, being the personality type that she is and an individual that she is, didn't take kindly to this.
She told various people that she would regret what she had done that day.
Angela Burkett had said that she was going to stick her, and we took that meaning to be that she was going to stab her.
But did Angela follow through on her threat?
If Foster wasn't the one who stabbed Joanne, then they might have just let the killer go free.
Coming up, witnesses describe the final confrontation between the two women.
After months of this going on, Joanne was not going to take it any longer.
Only one of them was walking away from this.
Investigators have arrested Glenn Foster for the murder of Joanne Hemingway. But new testimony has led police to believe the stabbing was actually the result of a long-standing feud with 52-year-old Angela Burkett.
There's obviously more to this story. So even though they had two witnesses that claimed to see Glenn stabbing Joanne, police realised they could be wrong.
The further work we did post-charge, it began to distance Glenn Ronnie Foster from the offence itself. The significant witness evidence that we had showed that the accounts that were given were inaccurate.
Angela might be the one with the motive, but that doesn't necessarily prove that she's the one who did it. She could have easily gotten Foster to do her dirty work for her. Unfortunately, he's not willing to talk, even to save himself.
Detectives hope forensic tests on the murder weapon will clear up who dealt the fatal blow. But when the results come back a few days later, it isn't exactly good news.
All three persons' DNA were present on the handle of the knife. What the scientists could say was that main contributor to that profile was Angela Burkett. But because DNA techniques are so sensitive, they couldn't exclude Glenn Ronnie Foster or Gemma Joyce as being contributors to that profile.
Since all three of them lived at the same address, it's not unusual that all three of their DNA would be on the knife, so it didn't really help the investigation.
Instead, police focus on learning more about the feud between Angela and Joanne.
It was well known at the time that Angela Burkett was a bully. Subsequent inquiries revealed that this was commonplace amongst most of the residents.
There was still a lot of people that were being spoken to, and some of them had also witnessed what had gone on in the aftermath.
One of them was called Matthew McNamara. He was actually a friend of Joanne's and lived nearby. He was also a friend of Angela Burkett's.
McNamara tells police that Angela seemed to have it out for Joanne from the beginning.
The two of them both had these strong personalities, so when Joanne moved in, Angela tried to intimidate her as well, make her afraid like everybody else was, but Joanne stood up to her.
Joanna Hemingway wasn't one to take kindly to bullies, and she was going to say her mind and say her piece.
A few days before the stabbing, Joanne confronted Angela, shoving her to the ground in front of the whole neighborhood.
Joanne wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone else that Angela bullied as well, which is probably what sent Angela over the edge. She wasn't going to let anyone make a fool out of her like that.
This had all got way out of hand, and neither of them were going to back down, so it culminated into this one final tragic battle.
In fact, McNamara says Angela even confessed to the stabbing.
He claimed that Angela Beckett had approached him and said, "I've done something really bad, something that's going to result in me getting sent down."
Another friend also comes forward to tell police about conversations they've had with Angela after she was released.
Based on the evidence that the police now had, not just the physical evidence that they found at the scene, but the CCTV footage and the mounting witness testimony, it looked highly likely that she was the one that had delivered that fatal blow.
They're working on an arrest warrant when Angela starts threatening their witnesses. Apparently, she found out that people were going behind her back and talking with police.
Burkett had been intimidating one of our prosecution witnesses, McNamara, at the soup kitchen. She'd been overheard shouting things like, "You're a wrong and you're going to get it," towards him.
The self-protection and narcissism level there is huge. She's saying, "Look at me, I'm capable of murder. Are you really going to try to go against me?" That's how powerful she believes she is.
Investigators decide to take Angela into custody before she can make good on those threats.
Angela Burkett was arrested for witness intimidation. She was re-interviewed by officers, but once again gave no comment to any of the questions that were posed to her during the interview.
Foster still isn't talking either, even though his girlfriend seems perfectly willing to let him take the fall for her.
Fortunately, Angela's daughter decides to come clean and tell police what she knows.
I think there was a time where she was locked up in prison, which gave the police the opportunity to go see her when she was level-headed and didn't have the influence of anybody around her. There probably was a sense of guilt that she'd been involved in a murder.
She also could sympathise with Joanne as being a mother, and that Joanne would never see her daughter again, and that resonated with her.
She winds up corroborating what other witnesses have told police and agrees to testify against her mother.
On July 19th, 2017, more than 2 weeks after Joanne Hemingway was stabbed, Angela Burkett is charged with murder.
When we found out that it was Angela that had stabbed my mum, we was happy that she'd been arrested and that the person that was responsible for it was going to get punished. A bit of relief, really, that they'd got the right person.
They dropped the murder charge against Glenn Foster and changed it to assault. He might not have been the one who killed Joanne, but he clearly participated in the attack.
He was also charged with possession of an offensive weapon, which included a knife and a baseball bat.
But will prosecutors be able to get a conviction?
The defence don't need to prove innocence, the prosecution need to prove guilt.
Coming up, a daughter helps put her own mother behind bars.
They say that blood is thicker than water, and that suggests that you would be loyal to your family.
She knew it was the right thing to do.
On November 27, 2017, Angela Burkett stands trial for the murder of Joanne Hemingway. Prosecutors describe Angela as a neighborhood bully who stabbed Joanne because she was the only one who dared to stand up to her.
Angela was more than just a drug addict with a history of violence. She saw herself as the queen of Beverly Road.
I think she was incredibly proud about that reputation, the fact that she was top dog around there, and that no one would normally challenge her.
She was very threatening to people if she didn't get her own way. People were actually scared of her.
To prove it, the prosecution presents evidence from the crime scene, as well as CCTV footage from the attack.
The prosecution set out to show that it was actually Angela Burkett that had committed the fatal blow, and not, in fact, Foster, who it appeared was there at the time.
They also call a number of witnesses, including McNamara, Joanne's neighbors, and 2 friends who were with her after the attack.
But the prosecution's star witness is Angela's own daughter, Gemma Joyce.
They say that blood is thicker than water, and that suggests that you would be loyal to your family. But even Angela Burkett's own daughter admits that it was her mother who killed Joanne.
She revealed that she'd overheard this conversation where her mother had said, I've done something quite bad, I've killed someone, and she stood there in the witness box and testified against their own flesh and blood.
It must have been incredibly difficult for her to provide evidence to a prosecution that would basically look to convict her mother of murder, but she knew it was the right thing to do.
Gemma tells the jury that on the day of the stabbing, her mother had gotten into yet another argument with Joanne Hemingway.
An hour before the attack, Angela and Joanne had come to blows again outside their flats on Beverly Road.
She said that Angela was angrier than she had ever seen her before. The fact that Joanne had dared to humiliate her in front of the entire neighborhood really set her off.
It was quite clear that she was out for revenge. She was like a woman possessed, and she wanted this matter dealt with there and then.
Gemma says her mother convinced her and Glenn to help teach Joanne a lesson once and for all.
Mr. Foster was carrying a baseball bat, and he also carried a knife. Angela Burkett also had a knife.
They're shouting up at the windows to try and get Joanne out, shouting derogatory comments.
When Joanne comes outside, she and Angela go straight for each other. Gemma said things happened so quickly that she didn't even realize how badly Joanne was hurt until everything was over.
When Joanne Hemingway stepped back, Gemma Joyce noticed a puddle of blood on the center of her chest. The only person that could have stabbed her at that specific point was Angela Burkett.
But the defense argues that Gemma's testimony doesn't prove anything. The killer could have just as easily been Glenn Foster.
Gemma never actually saw the stab inflicted on Joanne Hemingway.
The defence were trying to say that Glenn Foster actually had the knife and delivered the blow that killed Joanne Hemingway.
They poke holes in virtually every part of the prosecution's case, including poor video quality and unreliability of the witnesses.
That was a really difficult thing to watch. People that were addicts having to stand in the witness box and give evidence to the best of their knowledge, and then they were questioned by her defence whether it was actually true and could they have been under the influence when what they were saying happened.
But what would the jury believe? On December 4th, 2017, they returned with a verdict after only 2 hours of deliberation.
We was panicking a little bit, didn't know what was going to happen. And then I remember there was a man at the end that stood up and the judge was asking, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty? And it felt like the longest pause ever for him to say guilty. But once he said it, it was just a massive relief. And a massive weight was lifted off our shoulders.
Angela Burkett was sentenced to life in prison plus 18 months for witness intimidation. She'll have to serve at least 20 years of that before she can be eligible for parole.
To protect her friends and family, Joanne Hemingway stood up to the neighborhood bully. And for that, she'd paid the ultimate price.
To some degree, when Joanne has the altercations with Angela Burkett, she signs her own death warrant. The fury that she invokes, Angela goes back to get that knife because she is going to teach Joanne her full and final lesson. And that's exactly what she does.
Joanne Hemingway has been taken away from her daughter and from her family, and they'll never get to see her again. And as much as the conviction of Angela Burkett is some small crumb of comfort to them, it will never bring her back into their lives.
Just knowing how my mum would want me to be, and she wouldn't want me to be sad. She'd want me to live the best life I possibly can. So that's what I'll try and do for my mum.
He was a gay rights activist devoted to improving the lives of others.
He was able to harness those traumatic experiences that he'd had in his youth.
He trained to be a counsellor and helped other people like him.
Until a 20-year friendship turned into a bizarre feud.
He believed that he was studying the dark arts, that he was involved in Satanism.
Poisoning someone through the air ducts, bugging their surveillance equipment, it just didn't make any sense.
And when their rivalry ends in bloodshed, investigators are left to determine fantasy from reality.
Was it revenge? Ha, you've been doing this to me, but look what I'm doing to you. Or was it something more?
Monday, October 30th, 2017. It's a crisp fall afternoon in one of London's most popular neighborhoods, West Kensington.
West Kensington is not the most affluent part of West London, but it's a nice area.
It's quite near places like Earl's Court and Kensington High Street, so it's not the kind of place that you'd normally expect anything particularly bad to happen.
But at 1:45 p.m., something bad does happen when police are called to the scene of a bloody crime.
It was an apartment building on Shaftesbury Place, Warwick Road, and like many older buildings, it needed work, so workmen were there constantly upgrading it.
Two workmen who'd been working on the heating system of the block of flats. The police got a call from these guys to say that a body had been found in one of the apartments.
When the police arrive at the apartment, they're greeted by a gruesome scene. There's the bloodied body of a man, and he's obviously been the victim of a vicious assault, but there's quite bizarre elements to it too.
They found a body laid out on the floor in one of the flats. The body was in a bad way. It had been stabbed and it was covered in a strange white powder that had crystallized.
Homicide detectives arrive soon after to begin an investigation. They have no idea what the white powder is or how it might be linked to the murder, but they are able to determine who the victim is.
The body was found in a flat owned by one Julian Aubrey.
Julian Aubrey was 55 years old and a longtime resident of the apartment building and pretty well known in the community.
We quickly found out that Julian Aubrey had been a counsellor working with victims of abuse, that in his spare time he was an artist.
Why would someone murder a man with such a sterling reputation?
Initially, investigators, I think, didn't quite know what to make of the crime scene. They were confused as to why a man would just be found with so many stab wounds in his own flat in this part of London.
He'd actually been stabbed 22 times. Some of them were deep enough. One went in his heart, I think, and he didn't suffer for long, I was told. What went through his mind for those 2 minutes, say? Dread to think.
Julian Aubrey grew up far away from the busy streets of London, in the town of Rochdale.
Julian's family was him, me, mum, dad, grandparents on both sides, great-grandparents when we were young. He was very close to his family, in particular his maternal grandma.
Growing up, Julian was very sensitive, he was a very gentle child, but he was also very adventurous.
At school, Julian's gentle demeanor often made him a target for bullies.
I remember seeing him in the playground being punched. Don't think he had a great deal of friends, because he was quite solitary.
Like a lot of children who are more sensitive, Julian was driven towards the arts, especially painting. It really gave him a creative outlet.
For the first decade of his life, Julian's upbringing was stable. It was not unusual. But then everything was turned upside down when his parents separated.
After my parents separated, things changed quite dramatically. I was 7, he was 11. Him being 4 years older, understood more, felt more. and he struggled. My mum was in a different relationship by this time, which wasn't a good one, and my brother hated my mum's new partner.
And that wasn't the only thing Julian was struggling with.
Even at a young age, Julian knew he was gay, and he came out to his family during this time.
I was probably 8 when I realised. I don't know how I knew, but just instinctively knew, I suppose. My mum was fine about it. I think she must have known too. I was very proud of him because I knew he had difficulties in that situation.
Around the same time, he also revealed a horrifying truth.
Julian had been sexually abused himself as a child.
Julian was preyed upon in the most awful way by somebody that had a position of trust and authority, somebody who was a member of his church.
An Anglican vicar was very much affected by that. Affected him for the rest of his life, which was an absolute tragedy.
It wasn't until years later, in his 20s, when Julian's abuser was finally brought to justice.
He managed to pluck up the courage to take this person to court at the Old Bailey, and this person was sentenced to a term in prison. Not long enough, I don't think, but nonetheless, he did go. He trained to be a counsellor and helped other people like him, other people who'd been abused sexually. It must have been fantastic therapy for him.
In the late 1990s, Julian moved to London and started a support group for abuse victims in the LGBT community.
I was very proud of that. He was the chairman of it, and he got quite a lot of recognition for it. There were many members. I suppose he thought he was getting somewhere, being recognised, for his hard work.
But for all his success, Julian continued to struggle with his own personal demons.
Julian suffered from bouts of low mood, and he started drinking and taking drugs. He told family members that they made him feel better.
My mum was very worried about him. He convinced himself and tried to convince us that it would be okay.
Of course, it wasn't okay. His drinking and his drug use continued to increase over time. And as it turned out, his family had every reason to fear that the worst would happen.
Had Julian's addictions ultimately led to his murder?
When you start taking drugs, you can get involved with the wrong people. I think that's what happened. Some of his friends were probably doing the same, and a few together, probably just took too much.
Coming up, investigators discovered that not everyone in Julian's life thought he was a saint.
Julian had had quite a few problems with neighbours over the last few months.
Why didn't anyone file a police report? Why didn't anybody try to get a restraining order?
London police are investigating the death of 55-year-old Julian Aubrey, a beloved counselor and activist in the LGBT community.
And he did lots of counselling work as well with victims of abuse. So for many people, it was really disturbing to see that he'd been targeted in such a vicious way.
Julian's family were completely shocked by what happened. They had no idea why anyone would want to do that to him.
Julian had been the victim of a brutal and bizarre stabbing.
Unimaginable. He was stabbed. He was obviously covered. I saw one cut to his ear, and it kind of made it a bit more real. Quite shocking, really.
As well as the stab wounds, the body seemed to be covered in a crystallized white substance.
At this point, they don't know what they have on their hands. A drug situation? They're just not sure. So they take a sample of that powder so they can send it to the lab for testing.
Based on the condition of the body, investigators believe the murder took place a few days earlier.
I don't think the police even know the actual sequence of events. But we believe that Julian died on the Friday, and his body was reported on the following Monday, so he'd been lying there all weekend.
Police very quickly put out word to the local community asking for information, anything at all to do with what Julian had done that weekend. but also, had anybody heard anything suspicious?
Police find no signs of a break-in, so they don't think Julian was killed in the course of a robbery.
The workers who discovered the body told the officers they found the door open. That meant that Julian had either opened the door for whoever killed him, or they had a key.
In the days after the murder, Julian's building was crawling with forensic officers who were trying to find evidence for who might have done this.
They were looking for the weapon, but they never found it. The knife has never been found.
However, it appears the killer did take one of Julian's belongings.
Mr. Aubrey's watch was missing when his body was found.
It's another strange detail in a very strange murder. Who knocks on someone's door, stabs them to death, and then takes their wristwatch but nothing else?
After several days, police still don't have a lead on the killer, but they do uncover some surprising news about the victim.
Julian was taking such harsh drugs like crystal meths. I was very saddened.
Crystal meth or methamphetamine can drastically alter behaviour. So initially it might cause euphoria, but it can lead to paranoia and aggressive, violent behaviours.
It just distorts your brain. Quite a harsh drug. It has devastating consequences.
According to those who knew him, Julian's drug use had transformed him from a loving caretaker into an emotionally unstable addict.
The Julian that was living then wasn't the Julian that I'd known or seen up to a year previous to that. He was always good fun, intelligent, but he just changed.
Detectives spoke to neighbours in the block where Julian lived, who told them that there had been some problems between Julian and other people who lived in the flats.
Standard neighbourly disputes over noise, problems with waste, the normal disputes that one would have with a neighbour.
And in the months before his death, Julian's outbursts had escalated.
He'd been accused of leaving furniture in communal hallways, at one point even throwing stuff out of his window, and generally just antagonising other people in the block.
A neighbor told police that Julian had become so volatile that they were actually concerned he may hurt somebody.
Investigators discover there was one resident in particular who seemed to bear the brunt of Julian's drug-fueled outbursts on a regular basis. 48-year-old Enrique Facelli.
Enrique Facelli lived opposite Julian.
But now everyone is saying that he and Julian were constantly butting heads.
Investigators knew that drugs contributed to Julian's combative behavior towards his neighbor, but it seemed Enrique Facelli was equally hot-headed.
Police had been called on a number of occasions to deal with conflicts between Mr. Aubrey and Mr. Facelli, and we've later learned that some of those were quite serious.
Did Julian's neighbor decide to end their feud once and for all?
It turned out Enrique was actually the one who'd found Julian's body, but he didn't call police. Instead, he told the two workmen who wound up reporting it.
He said he'd found him. He'd found the door open and that he'd seen Julian lying on the floor. And said he went downstairs to tell someone.
Coming up, investigators find out their victim might actually be an attempted murderer.
Julian was even trying to poison him with noxious substances.
He was terrified, and he actually slept with a knife under his pillow for protection.
After several days of investigation, West Kensington police have finally come up with a suspect in the brutal stabbing of 55-year-old Julian Aubrey.
It seemed as if Julian's drug addiction and increasingly aggressive behavior toward his neighbors was reaching a boiling point, and perhaps someone decided to get rid of him.
That neighbour was identified as Enrique Facelli. He was 48, and like Julian, he was a long-term resident of the building.
The feud between Julian and Enrique had apparently been going on for a couple of years, but detectives learned that the two hadn't always been enemies.
Up until 2015, there'd been no real indication of any animosity between them. They, by all accounts, were quite neighbourly towards each other, and no indication of any kind of problems.
I believe they were friends for about 20 years, living next door to one another.
A background check reveals Enrique Fiselli to be a long-standing member of London's Uruguayan community. He'd emigrated to the city in the 1990s.
Enrique grew up in Punta del Este. It's a small tourist town on the coast of Uruguay.
I spoke to a colleague in South America who has very good Uruguayan ties. She quickly found out that he was very popular among high society, particularly in Punta del Este, where the rich and famous tend to holiday. He had lots of wealthy connections.
Enrique worked for the Uruguayan embassy in London, focusing on tourism and media relations.
Fiselli had had a successful career in the diplomatic corps. He'd been the cultural attaché for 18 years.
He used this role for prominence, if you like, social prominence. He was quite respected in his own way.
His social circle included more than just diplomats, however. Enrique was also a prominent figure in London's gay community.
He was a highly educated and very sophisticated and cultured man.
They lived in the same apartment building in West Kensington, and that's how Enrique and Julian became friends. They were culturally very different, but in fact, they had a lot in common.
But Enrique's life had suddenly taken a turn for the worse in 2013, when he lost his job after nearly 2 decades.
At the time of the murder, Fiselli wasn't working. He'd recently been discharged.
We didn't get all of the detail, but we were told by multiple sources that he'd left under a cloud and that there'd been some difficulty around his behaviour when he left the Uruguayan embassy.
In the 2 years following his firing, Enrique and Julian's relationship had also fallen apart.
It seems that in 2015, the neighbourly spirit between the two broke down as they started antagonising each other.
I don't know what contributed to that. I don't know whether it was just a natural deterioration of the friendship or whether something specific happened.
Knowing what they do about Julian's drug abuse, the assumption at that point has to be that it contributed to their falling out.
In 2015, Enrique made a series of phone calls to police and the building's housing association.
Fiselli was making claims about Julian, about him causing trouble, about arguments between them.
Fiselli had made numerous complaints about Julian, saying that he was making noise in the middle of the night, he was opening his mailbox, leaving trash in communal areas, and also, bizarrely, that he was leaving excrement out, hopefully, so that Fiselli's dog would get the blame.
Julian's campaign of harassment seemed to make Enrique an obvious suspect. He had both the motive and the opportunity to commit the murder, so investigators bring him in for questioning.
The first thing they wanted to know is why didn't he report Julian's death? After all, he was the one that found the body. So why not report it?
Mr. Fiselli had completely denied any involvement.
Enrique admits to the ongoing feud with Julian, but insists that he wasn't the one to blame for it spiraling out of control.
Enrique made some startling claims. He said Julian was trying to poison him and he suspected Julian was pumping it into their apartment somehow.
Julian apparently put powder in their drain pipes or something. There's no evidence of this. This is just what Fiselli said.
Real or not, Enrique seemed terrified of Julian. He even told police he'd been sleeping with a knife under his pillow.
Because he was so scared that Julian was going to climb into his bedroom window at night.
According to Enrique, Julian's behavior had become so erratic that he decided, I'm getting out of this building for a while.
That doesn't necessarily mean Enrique is telling the truth.
The mention of keeping a knife under his pillow immediately stands out because, of course, Julian had been stabbed. It seems that Enrique must have been exaggerating, however, because the police searched his apartment and they couldn't find a knife that matched the one used in the murder. Detectives did collect some other items off Enrique, including some of his clothes and some of his personal effects.
As part of the investigation, police seized Fuseli's watch for forensic testing.
However, the tests would take weeks to complete, and in the meantime, police have no evidence linking Enrique to the crime scene.
At that point, there's no way to contradict his story or make an arrest, so they're forced to let him go. But if he didn't kill Julian, who did?
Coming up, new evidence turns the investigation upside down.
Fuseli had bought caustic soda crystals just 3 days before the murder.
It's a highly corrosive chemical similar to sulfuric acid.
It's been several days since Julian Aubrey was found stabbed to death in his apartment, and detectives are no closer to finding his killer. Their first suspect, Julian's 48-year-old neighbor, Enrique Fuseli, has been released following questioning.
They lived opposite each other for years. They had seemed amicable, but that relationship seemed to sour in recent years.
Enrique was the one who found the body, but he denied having anything to do with the murder, and his story appears to hold up. Police found nothing in Julian's apartment linking Enrique to the crime. No trace evidence like fingerprints, hair, or fibres, and those are things that you'd expect to find if someone had stabbed another person to death.
London police hope Julian's autopsy will help shed some new light on the case.
When the results of the post-mortem came back, police weren't surprised to discover that Julian had died as the result of multiple stab wounds.
The injuries sustained to Julian were pretty horrific, to be honest. Well, my brother's final months must have been terrifying.
To investigators, a stabbing already suggests something about the killer. A knife is much more personal than a gun, but to stab someone 22 times indicates either intense hatred or some kind of psychotic episode.
Of particular interest is the crystallized powder covering Julian's body.
When the medical examiner tested the powder, they found it to be a substance known as caustic soda, which is a really highly corrosive chemical similar to sulfuric acid.
Caustic soda is a cleaning agent that can cause some seriously nasty burns.
Enrique was convinced that Julian was pumping chemical substances through his air ducts. Could it have been that caustic soda?
Detectives search Julian's home looking for more of the substance, but they don't find any. However, they discover Enrique does have a bottle of it in his apartment.
Police decide to dig a little deeper into Enrique, including his financial records, and some of the things he'd bought were very interesting.
Police found records of Mr. Fuseli purchasing caustic soda in the supermarket below their shared block of flats.
Police already know about the chemicals, but what concerns them is when Enrique bought the soda.
It turned out that Fuseli had bought caustic soda crystals just 3 days before the murder.
The timing suggests premeditation because, after all, if you're going to kill someone, what better way than using industrial strength cleaner to get rid of the evidence?
That wasn't the only strange thing he'd bought. Enrique had made a number of purchases over the last several months, and they all painted a picture of someone who was convinced someone was trying to kill him.
Investigators discover Enrique had also invested in a forensic report aimed at detecting bugging devices. But that was only the beginning.
Mr. Fuseli had paid for the flat to be swept for listening devices. He'd spent a fortune on rented apartments outside of London to get away from Mr. Aubrey. To him, the threat from his neighbor was very real.
Is it evidence that Enrique was planning to murder his neighbor? Or does it prove that everything he told police is true?
It's suspicious that he'd buy cleaning supplies just before Julian was murdered, but everything else supports Enrique's story about how afraid he was. That Julian was this dangerous drug addict with a vendetta against him. Not everyone felt that way about him, though. Some neighbours had complained, but as police took a closer look at those complaints, they seemed fairly mundane.
The question is, if Julian was so unhinged, if Julian was so potentially dangerous, why didn't anyone file a police report? Why didn't anybody try to get a restraining order?
They couldn't prove anything one way or the other. But a lot of what Enrique was saying just didn't make sense. Poisoning someone through their air ducts, bugging someone with surveillance equipment, that doesn't sound like something your drug-addicted neighbour would do. It sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
Coming up, investigators get a closer look into a disturbed mind.
Fuseli was convinced that Julian was a member of a satanic cult.
He bashed the door down with an axe.
It's February of 2018, 3 months after the murder of Julian Aubrey, and there are still no charges in connection with the crime. However, investigators are still looking into Julian's former friend and neighbor, Enrique Fuseli.
Police were initially told that the bad blood between them started with Julian's escalating drug addiction.
Enrique claimed Julian's drug abuse made him fear for his life. But investigators discover Enrique was also battling some demons of his own.
It turns out the reason Enrique lost his job at the embassy was that he'd suffered a mental breakdown and spent several weeks in a psychiatric hospital.
We've got somebody who's had a very high-level job. He's intelligent, he's well thought of in his community, but still, he's struggling. He's struggling with his mental health problems.
After his hospitalization, Enrique's mental state only got worse.
He quickly descended into paranoia and hallucinations, most of them centered around Julian. And it wasn't just that he was trying to poison him.
Fuseli's allegations towards Julian were actually just products of a tortured imagination. They were completely fabricated.
But Enrique's fears were all too real to him.
Mr. Aubrey clearly upset Mr. Fuseli, and Mr. Fuseli's mental illness worsened to the extent that he became violent.
In 2016, there was a forced entry from Fuseli into Julian's flat.
He bashed the door down with an axe and terrified Julian. Julian must have been absolutely scared for his life.
Here's a situation that's very clearly becoming out of control. There's a very clear indicator here for ongoing risk.
He was arrested and obviously seen by a mental health team.
After the incident, Enrique had been readmitted to the psychiatric hospital for evaluation.
The housing association, which ran the block of flats, noted that Fuseli had been displaying signs of extreme paranoia and delusions, which are thought to have continued until July 2017, where he was committed to a psychiatric hospital for 28 days.
He was kept for the requisite 28 days and released, deemed to be not to be a threat.
After that time, he was released and went back to living in the block of flats in West Kensington.
He was released after that, free to live next door again.
3 months later, Julian Aubrey was dead.
The fact that Enrique was the one who suffered from mental illness, of course, didn't help his case. But it also didn't prove that he was the one who murdered Julian.
Many people who struggle with mental ill health and have erratic behaviours don't then go on to kill. It's extremely unusual.
Enrique stuck by his claim that he'd never stepped foot inside Julian's apartment the day of the murder. But when the forensic tests are finally completed, The results prove otherwise.
This took weeks to get the results because they had to be absolutely certain that the results were correct.
Those forensic tests demonstrated that Enrique Faselli hadn't just been in the apartment, he'd also been in contact with the body. They know that primarily because of the wristwatch.
While they were investigating the murder, police had taken Faselli's watch, and it was later found to have blood on the strap, and the blood belonged to Julian Aubrey.
The watch also turned out to be Julian's, and the police noticed that it was missing when they were examining his body. So finding Enrique with it again tied him to the crime.
And that's not all they find.
Apart from the caustic soda found on Julian's body, they also found traces of Faselli's DNA.
Those two pieces of evidence completely blow Enrique's story apart. He was in the apartment on the day of the murder, and he was in contact with the victim. And instead of notifying police, he'd taken his watch.
The forensics proved absolutely that it was him. It was definitely him.
A toxicology report also shows that at the time of the murder, Enrique was high on the drug GHB.
GHB is an illegal party drug, sometimes referred to as liquid ecstasy. It can produce euphoria, intense sexual feelings, but it can also provoke hallucinations and blackouts.
With all the evidence they had collected, police now had enough to rearrest Faselli.
On February 28, 2018, Enrique Faselli is once again taken into police custody. This time, he is charged with murder.
They did a great job. Huge respect for forensic science. I think it's amazing.
He pleaded not guilty to the murder of Julian Aubrey, and the case was scheduled to go to trial at the Old Bailey.
The question was whether Enrique was actually mentally fit to stand trial. So the judge ordered Enrique to remain in custody and to undergo psychiatric evaluation.
Enrique Faselli is not a bad man. He's somebody who has clearly started to develop very paranoid beliefs. So he's somebody who's tortured, really. He believes that he's being persecuted, and it feels very, very real to him.
Coming up, will a deranged killer be brought to justice, or will he go free?
The court hearing was a huge surprise.
"48-year-old Enrique Faselli is set to stand trial for the brutal murder of LGBT activist Julian Aubrey. Prosecutors believe he stabbed his neighbor 22 times in retaliation for crimes he never actually committed.
He believed Julian was trying to kill him, so he killed Julian instead.
We were all hoping that Faselli would be convicted of murder.
But the day before the trial starts, there is a surprising development.
Faselli was due to stand trial for murder, but he pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility.
The results of the psychological examination revealed that Enrique was suffering from schizophrenia.
Mr. Faselli was found to have severe mental health problems that meant that he wasn't fully in charge of his faculties at the time of the murder.
On August 8, 2018, the court hears arguments from both sides to determine Faselli's sentence.
We finally went into the courtroom and all stood for the judge. And then Faselli was brought into the dock. He was actually brought in by 5 other people. We only have 2 usually. Maybe that's some indication of how his mental state actually was.
The prosecution concedes that Enrique's psychological issues were a contributing factor.
Mr. Faselli clearly had a long history of mental health difficulties, which the authorities were aware of, and you have to wonder whether the murder might have been avoided had he received the correct treatment.
However, the fact that he attempted to destroy the evidence of his crime implied Enrique knew exactly what he was doing.
Fuseli stabbed Julian 22 times, left his body on the floor, and smeared caustic soda all over him.
If you're having a psychotic break, do you actually have the sense of mind to clean it up afterwards?
To see Fuseli there, who didn't look left or right, just stared straight ahead at the judge all the time. Couldn't get any eye contact. And I actually wondered whether he had any remorse or whether he really appreciated the circumstances he was in.
The defense argues there was no motive behind Enrique's actions.
He was suffering from delusions. He thought Julian was trying to poison him, so maybe, in his twisted mind, it really was some kind of poetic justice.
Was it revenge? Ha! You've been doing this to me, but look what I'm doing to you. Or was it something more?
Enrique's lawyers don't claim he is innocent, but they do ask the court to consider his schizophrenia as a mitigating factor in his sentence.
We've got a normally gentle man who is in a state of absolute torture and distress, and unfortunately, he takes a decision within that distress to take violent action against his neighbour.
To find out a man in his 50s has been murdered by his neighbour because of this bizarre paranoid episode in which he is convinced that there's devil worship afoot, that there's some kind of poison being pumped into his flat, that he's being watched and listened to. It was quite exceptional.
As part of the hearing, Louise Turner gives her own statement, asking the court to give her brother justice.
Although he was obviously ill, I can't help think that he knew what he was doing as well. He must have known. Must have intended to kill him.
At the end of the day, the judge decides to accept Enrique's plea and sentences him to a secure psychiatric facility.
The lasting effect is quite simply my brother is gone. The fact that Fuseli took my brother's life and has affected me so much, I think in some ways he's got off lightly. He still has a life. He's still alive. No more. Julian. Fuseli's still here. So I am angry at that.
The judge, with the agreement of two psychiatrists, agreed the best thing to do was to admit Fuseli to a mental health institution for the protection of the public.
No time limit given, so we don't know how long he's going to be away for. Could be 5 years, could be many more years. But when he is released, if he is released, it has to be approved.
Enrique Fuseli would no longer pose a threat to his neighbors, but to the friends and family of Julian Aubrey, his death remained a tragedy on many levels.
It's the absolute sadness and sorrow that I feel it's just so, it could have been avoided.
To have a neighbour who has forced his way into someone's home with an axe and a crowbar, then killed the same person just 2 months later, you have to ask whether the authorities did the right thing by releasing Mr. Fuseli after 28 days.
I'll never forget Julian. And, you know, when I'm an old lady, I'll still think about it. I wouldn't wish this on anyone.
跟这并一块儿，我都应该坐中间来了。谢谢喵敏，谢谢喵敏的礼物吧。缆车多少钱？60块钱往返，大家没？哎，咱家有40级的哥们儿喊个喇叭吗？随滨看大海，或者滨发秦皇岛，帮我喊个喇叭行吗？40级大哥。
Wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover. And baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Waiting you back there again, play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window, wonder if I could bring them down. If I could bring my love now, baby, you make.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. I did not come this far for any stronger. All of a sudden there was nothing left. Well, last night a doctor thought you were lying. I never meant to keep you alive. There might be stuff we said that sound dumb to you, but to get a red wine and take it with a lemon.